It's good to be with you today. Thank you for coming. In this presentation, I'd like to share the story of three people, C.F. Andrews, Mahatma Gandhi, and Badshah Khan. Andrews was a Christian from England, Gandhi was a Hindu from Gujarat, and Khan was a Muslim from the Peshawar Valley in northwest frontier province. They became soulmates, three friends from three faiths with one heart. And in their spirited struggle for freedom and transformation on the Indian covenant, they were of one mind. These three people, as persons and as companions, have profoundly shaped my understanding of faith-based and interfaith-shaped engagement with the world of oppression, violence, and poverty. Let me begin with C.F. Andrews. I first became interested in Andrews because his name was the same as mine. And my initials were next in sequence, DF to his CF. And when we lived in Delhi, we stayed close to a colony named in his honour called Andrews Gunj. While we were in India, we became very close friends with a couple by the name of Matthew Titus and Anuvinda Varki. Anu's great-grandfather, S.K. Rudra, was the first Indian principal of the famous St. Stephen's College that Ange and I used to visit over in Old Delhi. And Anu told us that her grandfather was a friend of C.F. Andrews, and he used to come and visit them and their family. In fact, it was her grandfather that had asked Andrews to go to South Africa, where Gandhi was, to encourage him to come back to India to get involved in the independence struggle. And when Gandhi returned with Andrews, they came and stayed at Anu's grandparents' house. So she was telling me stories passed down by the family of Andrews and Gandhi and their friendship and their struggle for change. Charles Freer Andrews was born in 1871 in Newcastle, in England. In 1877, the family moved to Birmingham, where Andrews' father was called to be a minister in the charismatic Catholic Apostolic Church. Andrews said his father taught him two things: a love for prayer and a love for the poor. While Andrews was still young, his mother lost all her money through the duplicity of a family friend, and the family were plunged into terrible poverty themselves. But his parents' response to the disaster made an indelible impression upon the young Andrews. On the night they got the news of their total financial ruin, his parents quietly gathered the family together and prayed for forgiveness for the man who had ruined them. And from then on, Andrews watched his parents work and scrimp and save untiringly all day long, he would later write, for the sake of the kids. And he was later to say of his mother, her pure unselfishness made us ashamed to act in any self-indulgent ways. So he was nurtured within that kind of traditional of spirituality in his home. Andrews went to school in Birmingham, and in 1890, before he was due to start study at Cambridge, Andrews had a personal encounter with Christ that was to prove the turning point in his life. In 1896, Andrews became a deacon at Pembroke College Mission in South London, and in 1897, he became a priest. Later, he heard of the possibility of going to India. While at college, Andrews had become increasingly involved in the Christian Social Union and began to explore the relationship between a commitment to the gospel and a commitment to justice. And he became increasingly interested in the struggle for justice throughout the empire, particularly in India. So in 1904, when Andrews was invited to join the Cambridge Brotherhood, who were the order in charge of St. Stephen's College in Old Delhi, he jumped at the chance to go. However, Andrews was quite shocked at the racist attitudes of the British in India. He felt an immediate rapport with Indians who were trying to reform India and trying to struggle to create an independent Indian state. In 1906, Andrew decided to go public with his opinions, writing a letter published in the Civil and Military Gazette. And he openly supported Indian nationalists. As a British supporter of India, Andrews was invited to attend meetings of the Indian National Congress. But because he was seen as a trusted broker, he was often invited by the British and the Indians to broker deals and help them mediate conflicts. He was invited to, in 1913, to intervene in the Madras cotton workers' strike. And later, Gokhale, who was the leader of the Indian Congress, asked Andrews to go to South Africa to help the Indian community there who were being oppressed to deal with their problem with the British authorities. In fact, in 1915, Andrews was sent to Fiji to report on the ill treatment of Indian indentured labourers. And as a result of this, he was able to end any further transportation of Indian coolies to work in the cane fields in Fiji. In recognition of his advocacy on behalf of the poor, the Indians called him Dinabandhu, or the friend of the poor. While he was in South Africa, Andrews met Gandhi. And upon their return to India, Andrews worked very closely with Gandhi, the Congress and the unions. In fact, in 1925 and 1927, Andrews was elected the president of the All India Trade Union. And from 1931 to 1932, Andrews sat beside Gandhi at the Round Table Conference and helped him negotiate with the British government on behalf of the Indian National Congress. An immensely trusted British person who really identified with India in a way that helped them feel his commitment to them was really authentic. While working for independence of India, Andrews worked on dialogue between Christians and Hindus. He started out in a Christian community with the Christian Brothers in St. Stephen's, and he began to look around at other Indian Christians. One of the first he met that made a profound impression on him was a man by the name of Sadhu Sundar Singh, that some of you will know. But after a while, he wanted to get to know not just Indian Christians, but Indian Hindus with a similar spirituality. And he developed a very close relationship with Rabindranath Tagore, the prize-winning philosopher poet. And he went to stay with Tagore at Shanti Niketan in just outside of Calcutta. Tagore said of Andrews, by the way, that Andrews was a true follower of Christ and became my best friend. In 1925, Andrews joined Gandhi in the Vaikom temple protests, demonstrating against the prohibition of untouchables, who were seen as outcasts, who weren't allowed to even walk on the road that led to the temple. And they asked, the outcasts asked Gandhi to come, and he organised a protest against their exclusion. He did this with direct non-violence, and Andrews was involved in that protest with Gandhi. And it soon became the model for all their protests then in the struggle for independence in India. They eventually got not only to use the road, but to gain access to the temple. It was a remarkable achievement, and Andrews was there with him. Andrews supported the movement to ban untouchability of outcasts, and in 1933 he assisted Dr. Ambedkar, the great Dalit leader, in formulating the demands the outcasts, now known as scheduled castes, had developed for their own independence. One of the really significant and forthright conversations that Andrews had with Gandhi was to beg his friend to prioritise the elimination of untouchability over the struggle for independence. About this time, Gandhi asked Andrews to go back to India and work for India from Britain. He said it was about time Indians assumed full responsibility for the struggle for independence themselves. So from 1935, Andrews began to spend more time in Britain, going around the country, involved in student discipleship programs, and he became known, his initials became known in England as Christ's Faithful Apostle, CFA, Christ's Faithful Apostle. In 1940, Andrews died and was buried on a visit to Calcutta. While living in India, D.F. Andrews, tried to follow in the footsteps of C.F. Andrews. Like Andrews, I was appalled at the racist attitudes of some of the missionaries I met who told me you should never try to make friends with Indians because you can never trust them. I also met somebody who'd been there for 30 years who said you can never preach the gospel in Hindi because it's derived from Sanskrit, and that comes from the Vedas, and so it's fused with Hindu views that cannot carry the weight of the gospel appropriately. So you can't get to know Indians, you can't preach the gospel in Hindi, and I was appalled. Thankfully, I completely ignored their advice and lived with Indian people who became some of my dearest friends. Like Andrews, I devoted time to an intensive study of the language and culture, studying Hindustani as the common language, learned to read it and write it. And I particularly loved reading the writings of people like Rabindranath Tagore, who are at the forefront of the Indian Renaissance. If you ever want to read a book of religious poetry from a non-Christian tradition, I really would suggest you read Gitanjali. Gitanjali is a book of the most sublime religious poetry you could ever come across. And I really was deeply moved by connecting with Tagore like Andrews did. Like Andrews, I resolved to discover the meaning of a faith in Christ within the Indian context from a traditional Indian leader. Whereas Andrews learned from Sadhu Sundar Singh, I learned from a man by the name of Subodh Sahu, who I spent time with in a village and who taught me the Indian art of meditation, inductive study of the scripture, and how to conduct respectful dialogue with people of other religious traditions. And like Andrews, I wanted to share my reflections in writing about my time in India. And I tried to copy Andrews' writing in substance and in style, attempting with limited success to adopt Andrews' humble, vulnerable, accessible, personal, political writing style. And I've got a number of books here about Andrews and by Andrews, including one of his classics, Christ in Human Need, that I'd encourage you to look at. Last but not least, like Andrews, I sought to struggle for social justice like Gandhi. Which brings us to Mahatma Gandhi. Andrews wrote 3 books about Gandhi. However, the book that helped me to get to know Gandhi best was his own autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth. If you've never seen it before, I've got a copy of Gandhi's autobiography there to read. It's a powerful, very vulnerable, honest, authentic reflection on his own struggle to be a righteous man. I was particularly interested in how the non-violent philosophy of the famous Christian anarchist Leo Tolstoy, after whom Gandhi named his first ashram, Tolstoy Farm, shaped his own philosophy. Gandhi wrote, "Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You overwhelmed me. It left an abiding impression on me. Before the independent thinking, the profound morality and the truthfulness of this book, all the books given to me seemed to pale into insignificance." One of my most precious possessions is a collection of letters that I have here between Tolstoy and Gandhi. It shows a wonderful engagement between a Christian and a Hindu around everything from reincarnation to struggle for liberation non-violently. It's wonderful to see their interaction. Each time I go to India, when I'm in Delhi, I try to take time at sunrise before the chaos of the day is unleashed around the roads of the city, to take time to sit quietly in the morning mist in Rajghat, the memorial area dedicated to Mahatma Gandhi. Just to sit there and acknowledge the legacy of Mahatma Gandhi. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born in 1869 and raised in a Hindu family in coastal Gujarat in Western India. In 83, according to custom of that region at the time, the 13-year-old Mohandas had an arranged marriage to the 14-year-old Kasturabai. In 1885, while the young lovers were having sex, Gandhi's father died. And the fact that Gandhi was having sex with his wife while his father died made an incredible impact on Gandhi. He felt he was distracted by his desire from his duty to attend to his father, and it haunted him for the rest of his life. And for the rest of his life, Gandhi struggled with his sexuality because he saw it as an issue distracting him from his sense of duty. And eventually it led him to taking the vows of brahmacharya, which is a vow to complete sexual abstinence, even in marriage. The Krishna of the Bhagavad Gita was Gandhi's model of righteousness. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, "Wherever there is failure of righteousness and uprising of unrighteousness, then I create myself. For the establishment of righteousness, I appear age after age." And even though Krishna was actually a warrior fighting on the battlefield in Kurukshetra, at the time he said these words, for people like Gandhi, the Krishna of the Gita was still a model for non-violent struggle, because he said Krishna is mythological, the Gita is allegorical, and the fight we're called to is a metaphorical battle between good and evil. Gandhi was trained in law in the Inner Temple, one of the inner courts of London, and was called to the bar in 1891. He moved to South Africa in 1893 to represent an Indian merchant in a lawsuit and stayed on for the next 21 years, during which time he learned to engage with poor Indian labourers and struggle for their rights through non-violent resistance. While campaigning in South Africa, Gandhi met Andrews. And Andrews talked to him about the radical Christ that Gandhi had come to know through reading books by Tolstoy. Gandhi discovered the gentle figure of Christ, quote, "so patient, so kind, so loving, so full of forgiveness that he taught his followers not to retaliate when struck, but to turn the other cheek." And he found that Christ was such a beautiful example of this perfect person. His example became, he said, a crucial factor in the composition of my underlying faith in nonviolence, which rules all my actions. After effectively organising the Natal Indian Congress and successfully leading non-violent protests for the oppressive treatment of Indians in South Africa, Gandhi returned to India triumphantly in 1915, hailed then as the Mahatma. The word Mahatma was one that Rabindranath Tagore actually coined for Gandhi. The only one, by the way, that the Mahatma allowed to use his personal name, Mohan, was Charlie, C.F. Andrews. Charlie Andrews not only used his first name, his personal name, but Gandhi said he was the one that confronted him with the truth most vigorously. Gandhi said of Charlie Andrews, I have not known a better man. When we met as brothers and remained so to the end. Our friendship was an unbreakable bond between two seekers of truth and two servants. There was no distance between us. Upon his return to India, Gandhi began to wear traditional Indian cotton clothes, dhoti and khadi shawl, and he began to spin cotton. He wanted not mass production, but production by the masses in villages that could actually generate an income for village people. From the village base, where he stayed in the centre of India, Gandhi then travelled around the whole of India on third-class train. Those of you that have travelled in India know there is no longer third class. There's only first and second class. But I was there still when there was third class. And I can remember standing once, we were so packed in that I couldn't get both feet on the floor for a few hours. All I could do was change feet. And Gandhi chose to travel third class to visit the 600,000 villages in India to find out what their needs were. In 1921, Gandhi assumed the leadership of the Indian National Congress and set about organising peasants and rural farmers and urban labourers and guided campaigns to promote equality and support inclusivity and eradicate untouchability. Above all, Gandhi advocated independence from the British. He wanted Swaraj rather than British Raj, self-rule rather than British rule. The two ways that he wanted to advocate that was through what he called Sarvodaya and Satyagraha. Sarvodaya means a commitment to the service of all, and Satyagraha means a willingness to be committed to doing what is right, to hold on to the truth. It means literally to hold on to the truth, regardless of the opposition. In 1928, Abdul Ghaffar Khan came down from the northwest frontier to a meeting of the Indian National Congress and met Gandhi. They made an odd couple. At nearly 2 metres tall and weighing over 100 kilos, the Muslim Pathan Khan stood head and shoulders above the small, skinny figure of the Hindu Gujarati Gandhi. But they were soulmates. Khan was so akin to Gandhi in his approach to Swaraj, Sarvodaya, and Satyagraha that Khan became known as the Sarhadi Gandhi, the frontier Gandhi. Odd couple, but they were twins. They were of one mind. In 1930, Gandhi led a brilliant classical protest against the imperialist imposed salt tax in India. And this protest fired the imagination of the whole country. From the 12th of March 1930 to 6th of April, Gandhi marched 15 kilometres a day for 24 days from his ashram to reach Dandi on the coast, some 400 kilometres away, where he gathering people along the way. And when he got to the sea, he made salt which was an illegal act because if he didn't pay tax, because the British charged tax on that production. And when Gandhi broke the salt laws at 6:30 a.m. on 6th of April 1930, it sparked a large-scale acts of civil disobedience against the British Raj salt laws by millions of people around the country. The Indian National Congress declared independence from India, of India, declared independence from Britain, but the British did not recognise it. By the late 1930s, however, the Congress began to take a role of provincial government. And in 1942, nearing the age of 73, Gandhi called on people to completely stop cooperating with imperial government and for the British to quit India. And this, of course, became his famous Quit India campaign. After that, he was imprisoned for 2 years. And sadly, during that time, Kasturbai, who was imprisoned with him, died. Abdul Ghaffar Khan had always supported Gandhi's vision of a united, independent, secular India, respectful of all religions. But Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was the leader of the Muslim League, demanded a separate Muslim homeland from Hindu India. So in 1947, when Britain granted independence, the British Indian Empire was partitioned into two dominions, a Hindu majority India and a Muslim majority Pakistan. As displaced Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs passed each other in the great migration from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India, there was unspeakable violence. Up to 2 million people were slaughtered as Muslims moved to Pakistan and Hindus moved to India. The British sent the police to the northwest frontier of Pakistan border, and they sent one man to Bengal. That was Gandhi. And Gandhi went to Calcutta and threatened that if they didn't lay down their arms, that he would starve to death. And Gandhi actually brought the end to violence in Calcutta, whereas the British soldiers didn't up in northwest frontier. On the 30th of January 1948, Gandhi was 78, and Bapu, or the father of the nation as he was called, was shot by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist, because Gandhi had advocated for the Hindu majority to pay more money to the Muslim majority who he felt were dudded in the partition. So Gandhi was killed not by a Muslim, but by a Hindu nationalist. Gandhi showed me how to have friendships with people of other faiths. The Hindu Gandhi's companionship with the Christian Andrews and the Muslim Khan were deeply profound, tender-hearted, life-giving, long-lasting relationships. Gandhi died because he would not renege on his commitment that he made to Khan to make reparations to Pakistan. And before he died, when Andrews visited India and became very ill in Calcutta, Gandhi heard that he was sick and on the point of death. So Gandhi made the trip to Calcutta, where he stayed and nursed Andrews until he died, holding his hands, bathing his forehead, caring for him to the end. So Gandhi had deep and profound relationships with the Christian Andrews and the Muslim Khan. And I found that very inspiring, to see the possibility of really deep, meaningful, mutual friendships across religious traditions. Gandhi taught me about Sarvodaya, the service of all. Gandhi said, I will give you a talisman to help you make good decisions. Recall the face of the poorest and the weakest person whom you've ever seen and ask yourself if the step you are contemplating is going to be of any use to them. He says, if it's going to be good to them, it's a good decision. If it's not good for them, it's not. Sounds very much like what Jesus said, in as much as you do it unto the least of these, you do it to me. And Gandhi embodied that spirit of Christ in his engagement with the poor and a call to Sarvodaya, the service of all, particularly the least. Gandhi also taught me about satyagraha, the importance of holding on to truth in the midst of conflict non-violently. He taught me that it's important to search for the satya, or the truth, in the situation, even though we don't know it. Saying that the only way we could do that with integrity is through ahimsa, non-violently, not violating anybody in the quest for truth. And the only way you can search for the truth of any situation non-violently is to be prepared to suffer yourself rather than cause suffering, what he called tapasya. He said satya, ahimsa, and tapasya are really the guidelines for genuine encounter in the struggle for truth, for love and justice. Gandhi developed a code of conduct for satyagraha, the rules of which are: never harbour any anger but suffer anger of an opponent, protect opponents from attack even at the risk of your life, do not submit to an order given in anger even if threatened, refuse to return assaults, refrain from insults, and do not resist arrest. And if taken prisoner, behave in an exemplary manner. I would suggest, as a Christian, as a follower of Christ, that the Hindu Gandhi took Jesus more seriously than most Christians do. And in fact, I would like to suggest it's because he didn't believe in the deity of Jesus, that he believed the relevance of Jesus as a man was a much more viable model for us to live than most Christians who over-divinize Jesus. Do you understand that? I'm saying it's not an accident that he took Jesus more seriously as a model for humanity than Christians do. And I think it's through Gandhi that we can recover the relevance of Jesus for the struggle for justice. Badshah Khan. I got to know about Abdul Ghaffar Khan in India by reading Eknath Eswaran's great book, which I have here, called A Man to Match His Mountains. After reading the book, I got a chance to go to Afghanistan for TIA. We were trying to find ways that we could actually support women who were excluded from generic health services under the Taliban, look for ways that they could get support. And while I was there in Jalalabad, which is one of the bastions of the Taliban, I found my way to the grave of Abdul Ghaffar Khan in Jalalabad. Last month, I took part in a teleconference with Raj Mohan Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi's grandson, and we were talking about the struggle for resilience in working for love and justice in a world that's so characterised by oppression and violence and poverty. And one of the examples that Raj Mohan Gandhi thinks is an example for us is the life of Abdul Ghaffar Khan, Mahatma Gandhi's great friend. And I've got Kudai Kitmatkar, or servant of God. And keep, his commander cried, is your patience so exhausted so soon? And they were protesting the brutality of the British Raj. Troops from a nearby base were ordered to disperse the crowd. And without warning, they drove armoured cars into the crowd, killed many people and wounded others, and asked the crowd to withdraw. But the crowd said, we will only withdraw if you give us time to pick up our dead and wounded. They refused to do so, so they refused to withdraw. Then it was a standoff. And they said, if you do not withdraw, we will fire upon you. So from that point on, the crowd of Kudai Khidmatkar stood in front of the police, of the the soldiers, who aimed their weapons at them, demanding them to withdraw. And the troops opened fire, shooting at point blank into the front row of the crowd. When those in the front row fell wounded, the next row came forward and took their place. Over and over again, from 11 a.m. in the morning till 5 p.m. at night. Row upon row, Kudai Kidmatkar stood up, these fierce warriors. They opened their chests and they said, "You may kill us, but we will not withdraw without our wounded." 200 to 300 were killed. Many more were wounded. Eventually, the elite Garawara rifles, who were brought in to deal with the crowd, put down their weapons and said, "We can no longer do this." And Gandhi said that was the day that the British Empire ended. And he said it wasn't ended by me, but by Abdul Ghaffar Khan and the Kudai Khidmatgar. Gandhi said the beginning of the end of the empire on which the British said the sun would never set. Khan, of course, was arrested again. He spent from 1930 to 1945 mostly in prison. After independence, however, Khan was finally released from prison, but was only rearrested and thrown into prison again by the government of Pakistan, because Abdul Ghaffar Khan advocated for a secular state, opposed an Islamic state that he said that would persecute minorities. Wasn't that precedent? And because he would not support an Islamic state, even though he was a Muslim, he then spent 1948 to 1988, most of that time either in prison or in exile. In 1988, Abdul Ghaffar Khan died in exile in Afghanistan. When I went to Jalalabad, I went to the tomb of Badshah Khan, and I asked the Afghan guard what he thought of Khan. He said, "What can I say? He was a failure. He fought for independence and he finished up in prison. He advocated non-violence and he ended up being buried in the middle of a civil war. Maybe he was a Badshah, but nobody, not even Pathans, want to follow him." Certainly he failed, but the Khan also succeeded where others before him and after him failed. For one majestic moment in history, the Khan had been able to take some of the fiercest warriors in the world and turn them into some of the noblest non-violent soldiers that the world had ever seen. Facing gunfire without flinching, refraining from all forms of violence, they sought not to slaughter but to serve, friend and foe alike, in the fight for justice. I wondered how different Afghanistan might be if they'd followed the example of Abdul Ghaffar Khan rather than the ideology of the Taliban. In 2013, the Nobel Prize winner Malala Yousafzai, the young Pakistani activist shot by the Taliban, spoke at the United Nations, one of the great speeches of the 21st century. And she made explicit reference to the inspiration of Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Gandhi, and Badshah Khan. She said, "Dear sisters and brothers, I'm not against anyone, neither am I here to speak in terms of personal revenge against the Taliban or any other terrorist group. I'm here to speak for the right for education for every child. And I want education for the sons and daughters of all the extremists, especially the Taliban. I do not even hate the Talib who shot me. Even if there is a gun in my hand and he stands in front of me, I would not shoot him. This is the compassion I've learned from Muhammad, the prophet of mercy, Jesus, the Christ, and Lord Buddha and Badshah Khan. I think all of us who would engage in a strong but gentle struggle for justice would do well to join the Khudai Khidmatgar. And say, I am a Khudai Khidmatgar, as the God needs no service. I promise to serve humanity in the name of God. I promise to refrain from violence, from taking revenge. I promise to forgive those who oppress me and treat me cruelly. I promise to refrain from taking part in feuds and quarrels. I promise to treat every person as my neighbour and friend. I promise to live a simple life, to practice virtue and refrain from evil. And I promise to devote at least 2 hours every day in voluntary social work. These are my free friends whose lives have been enormous inspiration for me and whose stories I've really felt privileged to be able to share with you today. The outline of this talk is available that you can edit, and it's got the sources of the material that I used that you can check out for yourself. And of course, there are these books here by these people and about these people that you're welcome to look at as well.